view on my.
Yeah. Hey
Okay,
everybody, how you
so
doing? This is Luke Marino. This is Tom Moriarty, and this is Life Cycles Live. Tom, I think this is episode 3, right? Chapter 3.
this is chapter 3.
Yes, in our series on your amazing book, and I'm going to again post the links to your book, and I think I need to add a link to your site. It's Alidade, correct?
Yep, Alidade dash hyphen symbol, and then the letters MER as in maintenance, engineering, and reliability.com.
Excellent. Yeah, and it's amazing what you've been able to accomplish over your career, both in the Coast Guard and then after the Coast Guard. And for those that haven't tuned into an episode on Tom's book, he is covering a chapter of his book he wrote on leadership. It's the productive leadership system. And Tom's been blowing my mind every time we sit down in one of these sessions because, and I'm going to preemptively strike Tom. And I did not tell him I was going to say this beforehand. But last session, it amazed me how much research you did on the topic of your chapter. It wasn't just like talking about the topic or even expanding on the way the human mind interacts in leadership situations. You like really dove in, and I find that really fascinating. And I thought, wow, that second chapter really separated your book from other leadership books I've read based on the session we had last time.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you noticed that. It's the as an engineer, you kind of go back to first principles, right? So as I started going through lining out what I was going to do with the book, the first chapter was about why do we want to improve leadership, right? So what's the problem, right? And so there's an economic problem, but there's also an issue for helping people to feel better about going to work and doing things, right? So there's some aspects, personal and economic, as to why we should care about improving leadership. The second chapter about the human brain is that, first and foremost, I wanted people to understand how your brain works so that you don't think just because maybe you're in the middle of your career or towards the end of your career that you can't learn something new. The point being is that your brain, all humans have the capacity to learn throughout our lives. And so I wanted to make sure that was there. And the other side of that coin is that because you can learn, your brain is very similar to the brains of the people that you lead. So when you put in policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures, or where you're giving people coaching and asking them to follow different direction, they can learn throughout their lives. And then the whole aspect of once you get somebody to behave a certain way, they have to be able to replicate that behavior several times before it becomes a habit. And then once most people have the same habit, that's where you establish the culture. It's not like waving a magic wand to be able to then say, yeah, we're going to do culture change and just, okay, give me 10 pounds of culture change. It doesn't work that way. There's actually work that you have to put in to do that. But it's not rocket science, it's brain science, right? And so now we get to chapter 3, and chapter 3, as I said on previous episodes, when I started thinking about what's the problem, right? Why is it that I go into all these different plants and there's always a dusty binder that's from 4, 5, 6 years ago where somebody was trying to do exactly the same thing that me and my team were trying to do. You flip through it, it's all logical stuff. The other consultants that were in there did a good job. So why didn't it stick? Right. And so when I started peeling back the onion, I started seeing it really boiled down to two things. It came down to accountability and it came down to individual leadership capability. And so chapter 3 is really about the accountability piece. And when we do chapter 4, that will be about the individual leadership capability. So
Gotcha. So, how many chapters are in the book total?
there's 5, and then I think 3 appendices.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a sign of So for those that are out there that haven't connected the dots, anytime you see appendices in a book like Tom's, it usually means it's like really the implementation type stuff, right? Like it could
Well,
be, go
yeah.
ahead.
So there's really three things that I covered in there. One is I kind of do a walkthrough through the standard for asset management because I want people to understand that when, especially Chapter 3, we're going to talk about today, there's a pretty strong link with the standard for asset management. So again, as an engineering thing, I wanted to be grounded on fundamentals to make sure that there were, strong links to industry standards and that sort of thing.
And you're referring
But then
to
else,
ISO 55,000?
yeah, ISO 55,000.
Okay.
Um, the other two have to do with if you're familiar, I did a survey with Plant Services Magazine, a leadership survey. Did it in 2015 and then just repeated again in 2021. I give everybody the nuts and bolts on what the team effectiveness and motivation portions of the survey were. The team effectiveness portion is really it's 20 statements that you get feedback from people, and you're able to kind of categorize how your team is doing in 5 different categories. Uh, the other one is motivation, and I use a thing called expectancy theory. And that asks a series of 11 questions that are in tandem. So it's basically asking, do you think this is how important are these aspects to you, and then are you getting those right, and then you can see what the difference is between the two. So it's a way to put a relative number on motivation level. And so when you look at both the team effectiveness part and the expectancy theory part, you can kind of, if you know who's answering which questions. Like if you're a supervisor doing that with your team members, or a manager doing it with the direct report supervisors that report to you, you can get an individual profile to see where the strengths and weaknesses are from your perspective, what you might need to do better to motivate people more on the expectancy theory side. But as kind of looking at as your team on the team effectiveness part, am I communicating well enough? Are we establishing the right norms in the group and those sorts of things? So you can kind of dissect it and get right to it. And what was and the third appendices is a thing I call it the requirements and execution model, which is basically how do you put processes and procedures in place. So it's a model that helps you think through what's important, and it goes into the standard flow charting and RASI diagrams, and then creating a document that combines those. But it's a lot more the thoughtfulness behind how do you do that.
Wow. That's all very, very, very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's like the telltale sign of a good resource is that it doesn't just introduce you to theory, unless of course that's what the resource is intending to do. But they
Yeah.
give you a way to implement what that theory in the real world, right? And I always walk around with my copy of Ben Blanchard's Logistics Engineering and Management textbook, and people go, "Wow, this thing's amazing." I said, "Yeah, the only thing it's missing is the implementation part." But there's nowhere else where you have all of this knowledge about that field in one spot, and that's why the textbook still sells for over $200 a copy.
Yeah.
But in the end, go do some of those things is a really big leap from reading the book to getting those things done. So.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so for those that aren't familiar, you're more than welcome to jump on the chat, and you're interacting with Tom and I live. Tom is going to go through a presentation, and he's going to get us really smart on Chapter 3 of his book. And so prepare yourself for some organizational reliability model and some amazing Tom. Look, I'm just warning everyone right now. Diving into Tom's brain is a risk. But it's a good one. It's a good one worth taking. So,
Yeah. Well, and like I said, I try to make this practical, right? I want somebody to be able to read the book, get the concepts, but then also be able to apply it. Like you said, it doesn't do you much good if you can't apply it, right?
That's right.
And so a couple things, generally speaking, the book, I really tried hard to make it something that would be useful, something that people could pick up and you know, at least pull nuggets out of. If you couldn't grasp all of it, and at least pull some nuggets out of it. And there's a couple of tools that I embedded in this presentation we're doing today. But the main thing that I developed the organizational reliability model for is to assign accountability and to be able to diagnose where there are accountability gaps. Because if everybody's run across somebody in their career where that person just doesn't take accountability, and they could be a very senior person or a mid-level manager, a supervisor. They just refuse to take accountability. And so there's ways to diagnose that, and once you diagnose it, then you can deal with it, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to work for that guy or that lady, right? We want people that are accountable.
Yes.
And so, and again, with all of the models and all the things that I do in the book, you'll notice that I don't target it towards any type of personality. There's not one type of personality that you need to have to be able to do this stuff. It's, again, based on the human brain. Everybody's different. Everybody's has a range of personalities. So, it was written with that in mind. All the models were created with that in mind. So with that, I'm going to get going here.
Right.
I just included this slide. If people want to, they can go back and study this, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. It's just a little bit of my background, some of my experiences and my education and so forth. So it's up here long enough. So if you go back and look at this, you can pause it on this screen if you so choose.
You're missing something under the office location. I need to know the proximity to the closest golf course, because from what I understand, it's like
about a mile and a half.
There you go.
I was just there earlier today hitting a bucket of balls. So life is hard.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions, right? The first thing, can a leader expect others to carry out roles and responsibilities if those roles and responsibilities are not clear? Can a leader expect others to carry out roles and responsibilities if they're not provided with the assets and the resources they need to actually carry it out? And who's accountable to provide the roles and responsibilities and the assets or resources that are needed? And if a person is given clear direction, clear guidance, and the required assets to carry out that guidance, can you, as a leader or somebody that they report to, can you then hold them accountable to actually execute efficiently and effectively? So those are the questions that we're going to be answering. So when you look at any organization, there's multiple levels within that organization. So a typical organization probably has 6 or 7 levels. A president or senior executive, maybe vice presidents, maybe business unit leaders, a department or function managers, assistant managers, supervisors, and then team members. So across each leadership level, there's a senior person and one or more junior persons. An example would be that if you have a manager, that manager would be a senior leader to the supervisors that report to them. Okay. Senior persons need to be accountable to provide direction, guidance, and assets. And junior persons have to be accountable to execute efficiently and effectively, and to notify the senior persons when there's deficiencies in direction, guidance, or assets. Right? That's how we set up these accountabilities. So accountability is what enables an organization to function. You then have individual leadership capability that makes it happen, that brings that organization to fruition, right? They start being able to carry out those functions. And that part, the individual leadership capability, is what we'll talk about in the next session. And that's the productive leadership model. So let's talk a minute about direction, guidance, and assets. Direction, pretty simple. It's mission, vision, values, and objectives. Those all have to be aligned across all levels of the organization. And we use that to create the requirements and to make decisions. Guidance are policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. And these are developed to achieve the organization's direction. And we also need to be aligned across levels of leadership and among peer groups. So, an example of that, the maintenance department has to be aligned with the operations department and with the support folks that provide materials and parts and things, right? We can't do things in a vacuum. We have to make sure that we're coordinated. But to that end, if you have a procedure or a process that involves two or more peer groups, then the people that are accountable to make sure that those teams play together, that's up one or two levels, right? The accountability to make sure that those procedures and processes are correct resides above the two peer groups.
And so, Tom, just to make sure I'm following, because I'm slow, even though I talk fast. um, we're looking at the, and this is particularly for those that may not have experience in like organizational leadership studies or something like that, right? Which you and I get a little bit of taste of that when through our career path. But I studied org leadership for about 2 years before I switched my major and said, let me go do something the Coast Guard's going to pay me to get a master's in.
Yep.
So we're looking at this through the lens of organizational leadership context, right? Like we're looking at the
Yep.
responsibilities, roles, and impacts of leadership across the different levels of the org.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly. So, like ISO 55000 applies to the entire organization, right? And if you think about that pyramid, just think another face of that pyramid is a different department, right? So those all have to come together and form, one structure. Okay. Okay. So the next thing is assets, right? And assets are simply the things that you need to carry out the direction and guidance. And so guidance needs to identify the types of assets that you need, the quantity of them, the quality of them, and the life cycle, right? So just think about, let's say, if you needed to have a piece of software to manage some process. Well, that's the type of software that you need is management software. The quantity, how many seats do you need? The quality is what types of functions does it support? Does it support all the functions that we need it to? And then life cycle is, every software suite that you purchase, there's an upfront cost and then there's an annual maintenance fee. And after so many years, it's probably no longer supported, right? So you have to think about those aspects of assets. Okay. Assets can also be, your human assets, your human, the people that work below you. It could be the budget. It could be, the tools, equipment, whatever it might be. Those are all assets. And then there's also inputs, right? So when we go through the model, you'll see in the bottom half of the model, there's inputs and outputs, right? So inputs can also be things like the raw materials that go into your process. It could be utilities, it could be contractors, it could be the availability of new hires. All those sorts of things can be also a form of asset.
Not to pull you away from the flow there, but and not definitely not to start a fire. Okay, because I know this can be a contentious question.
Yeah.
Um, People as assets, man, have I caused some problems when I've referenced people as our organization's greatest assets with good intentions at headquarters a few times.
Oh,
You
sure.
know, yeah. Do you find the same to be true in the field when you talk to leaders in the maintenance and reliability community, or not so much?
Yeah, some people have an issue with that phrase. I write that monthly column in Plant Services Magazine, and it's called the Human Capital column. I didn't come up with that name, but that's what it is. And about every 2 years, I get somebody that says, "You really need to change the name of that column." Okay,
What's
but
ironic about that is if they knew you, they would know that you don't look at people as expendable capital.
oh, not at all, not at
Yeah.
all. I look at people as they're an asset that can gain in value over time, right? They should gain in value over time as they acquire knowledge and experience, right?
Mm.
So that's a very important thing. So now I've highlighted guidance and assets here because when I talk about guidance and assets as a combination, I refer to that as requirements, right? So there's a requirement that might be a policy or a process or a procedure, but it's also the assets that go along with that. Those are the requirements. And we'll see how that fits in. And the other thing I'll say is that when you talk about requirements, there's really three different types of requirements, right? There's identified requirements. So you'll see as we go through the model, there's a part where you define what the new guidance is going to be or should be, and you should identify what are the assets that need to go along with that. So that's identifying the requirements. Once you decide, yes, we're going to go forward with this, then it becomes the authorized requirements. But then it's also, once you actually put it into place, there are the current requirements, right? So you could be authorized 10 people in your work center, but you may only have 7 people in your work center, right? Currently, because they're out sick or they hit the lottery and retired early or whatever it might be. So you have to understand that there are different categories of requirements, right? And that becomes important in a minute when we get to that point. So as I said, the models that I put in place throughout the book, I tried to make sure that they didn't work in opposition to anything that's already out there, right? So ISO 55000, Lean, Six Sigma, all these different tools, root cause analysis, RCM, all of it fits into this model. Uh, in this case, I'm going to talk about ISO 55000, and this is very similar to what you see in the actual document. Um, Organizational objectives come from the strategic plan for the organization. You have this set, the asset management policy, strategic asset management plan, asset management objectives, and life cycle asset management plans. That's referred to in the standard as the asset management system. And this is for sub-organizational direction, guidance, and assets. Okay. And again, this is along the bottom. You see lust to dust, cradle to grave, however you want to state it, but it's across the entire life cycle of your assets that you want to, make sure that you're putting in place policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. We also look that when we look at the model, you're going to see components of the model that talk about assess and define. And those are responses to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And those really fit into those three portions of the ISO 55000 model. And then when we get down to the actual procedures and processes, those are when we're finalizing and implementing those, the authorized requirements that need to be executed. Those are really what the standard calls the life cycle asset management plans. Okay. So if somebody's an aficionado of ISO 55000, there you go. So
We
just a
may
little
have
bit,
one or two of those in our audience.
I hope so.
Especially if we've got a couple of folks that are particularly they work solely in the asset management field, and I'm smiling from ear to ear right now because I love that you're and this was, I'm sure it was intentional because Tom, you're very smart, but you know connecting this content to those standards which people in the industry are familiar with, or at least aspiring to become familiar with, I think is
right,
extremely important because you're showing the linkage. Like, this isn't a foreign thing that you're like, well, first of all, we all know that leadership is something we're inherently interested in because it benefits us, right?
right,
But there's not a lot of people that invest in formal leadership training in the technical fields. And
right.
that's
And
just
that's, yeah. And so that's, one of the drivers for writing the book in the first place is trying to raise the standard a little bit, right?
I love it.
Uh, Okay. And so now just go back to basics here. When I talk about direction, I'm talking about mission, vision, values, and objectives, right? So mission is simply why the organization exists. Vision is what excellence would look like. and values are how the organization goes about achieving its mission and vision, right? And then objectives are setting up a prioritized set of accomplishments that need to be achieved, and they should be sequenced with dates and timelines for completion so that there's a good standard that you're trying to accomplish. So a couple of takeaways from the direction discussion is that organizational reliability is aligned with the asset management, the standard for asset management. And along with that standard, there were four fundamental aspects of asset management. And those included value, alignment, leadership, and assurance. So I just wanted to tie these together so that you understand um, how deeply this is tied to ISO 55000. So when you think about mission, vision, values, and objectives, those create what I call a North Star as to how to identify how value is measured and achieved, right? The second thing is that senior persons are accountable to ensure that direction is aligned at every level and it's supported by proper guidance and assets. When we talk about leadership, this is required to define, authorize, and implement guidance and assets, and to execute the current guidance with the current assets. And like I said, we'll talk a lot more about the leadership aspect of this in chapter 4 during our next event. And then assurance, this is where we want to be collecting data, assessing performance, defining and pursuing improvements. So when we think about SWOTs, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses are from internal, how you're doing things currently. Opportunities and threats are from outside your group, right? So it could be new technology, could be a change in regulations, whatever it might be. We have to have a way to identify SWOTs and then to address those SWOTs. Okay.
And we had our shipmate Wayne Barfield weighed in on one of your points, based, and I'm putting it up on the board or on the screen here. But reinforcement of these principles are key for long-term success, which is what you are installing. And I love that last point because this is not a short-term thing, man. And Tom is talking about putting a system in place that ensures you have long-term success because you're, like you said, Tom, you're falling on those core principles of leadership. Um, you know, I just love that this is something that should be iteratively reviewed. We do it
Yeah.
with FAMICAs and FAMIAs and supportability analysis and everything else that we feel is important for the assets. We should be doing this with our leadership systems as well.
Yeah, exactly. And to not to put too fine of a point on it, but when you think about, say, a production system, right? If you're making, bottling beer, right, or whatever it might be, you're always trying to make improvements. You might have something that was designed into that system years ago that has been a reliability issue or a high maintenance issue or something that's causing a lot of upsets. You don't just deal with it, right? You deal with
Right.
it until it becomes the thing that is the highest on your list, to then address, right? It's the same thing with people in your organization. If people have been hired into a position or they were promoted into a position and they're really not strong in that role, we don't give up on them, right? We want to work with them. We want to give them models and then give them coaching and mentoring to bring them along. And most people will respond to that if you do it correctly. There are, however, some people that just will refuse. And at some point, you need to put in the effort and you need to prove that this person is refusing to do it. And at that point, then you're going to look for another position for this person, or hey, maybe it's time to go fishing, buddy. But the idea is you don't give up on folks. It's just like anything else. You try to make improvements to it. And that's your job as a leader, is to make improvements, right?
Would you encourage them to take up golf, or are you worried you're going to run into them on the golf course?
No, because golf has a lot of metaphors for life, and I know Wayne would agree with that.
Yeah, he knows a little bit about golf.
Right. So here's the organizational reliability model. Okay, and this is the where I came up with this. All the circles. If you went to engineering school and you ever studied Moore circles, and you'll see why that came to mind here in a minute. But there's two halves to this model. The upper half is what I call the proactive improvement model portion of the model, and the bottom half is the control and stability portion of the model. Okay. The upper half, remember we talked about at every level of leadership, there's a senior person and there are junior persons that report to them. The senior person at each level is accountable to carry out the top half of the model. The people that report to that person are accountable to carry out the bottom half of the model. So when we go through this, the organizational reliability model defines and assigns accountability for some core activities. And the reason I did it this way is because I didn't want to say that, if you're the plant manager, these are your accountabilities. If you're a line supervisor, these are your accountabilities. That would make it very complicated and too specific. I think that when we keep accountabilities into categories of accountabilities, it makes it a lot easier for people to understand it first, and second, to actually use it. And so when I think about this, this model is effective for assessing, defining, authorizing, and implementing direction and requirements. So that's creating new or modifying current direction and requirements. Okay. The third thing is for executing, remember I said current requirements, so that junior person, the lower half of the model, they have current guidance and current assets. So they're accountable to execute what they currently have. But they're also, that junior person is accountable to communicate performance and performance good and bad, as well as deficiencies. So again, if I'm supposed to have 10 people in my work center and I only have 7, that's a deficiency that I need to report to my boss, because we're going to see guidance and assets have to be balanced. If I ask you to carry out 10 persons worth of PMs and corrective maintenance, but I only have 7 people, I can't do it all unless you give me overtime or you give me more employees or whatever. There has to be something to that. It has to be resolved.
What if I just take away sleep?
You can do that for about 3 days.
Bad leadership.
then people get punchy. So now, as I said, this model applies at every level of leadership. So if you're the plant manager, you're the senior person, and you have perhaps department heads that are your direct reports, right? You go to the next level, that junior person that was the department manager is now the senior person to the assistant managers that report to that department manager. In the same way, that junior assistant manager at the next level down is the senior person when that person is addressing supervisors. And the same thing happens. The junior supervisor becomes the senior person when dealing with team members. So there have to be linked accountabilities across all levels of leadership. And all of those folks in the middle have both a senior leader and a subordinate or junior person accountabilities. So each leader is accountable as a senior person and as a junior person. And when we use this model, it's a lot easier to identify accountability problems, right? So for instance, if I have a department manager that is refusing to be accountable to make sure that guidance and assets are provided, well, we can see that very clearly in the model, right, where that gap is. So let's talk about a little bit more in detail here let's look at the top half of this model, the proactive improvement realm. There's 3 circles inside: assess, define, and implement. And you'll see from the bottom section going up, you'll see that light blue arrow that says strengths and weaknesses. And on the left upper side, you see opportunity and threat. And those are the SWOTs. So those get accumulated into that assess circle. And assess are the activities to identify, sort, filter, prioritize strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's basically where you're collecting all of those things. Define are the activities to collect information, analyze, develop, and authorize solutions. So remember I said a couple of slides ago that when I developed these models, I wanted to make sure that it accommodated ISO 55000, Lean, Six Sigma, whatever it might be. this is where it fits. When you, this is where things like lean and RCM and FMEA and defect elimination, things that you use to try to improve Kaizen, right? All these things that fits into define. Now, when I say that the senior person is accountable to define solutions, that doesn't mean that the senior person is rolling up their sleeves and being the ones that actually do root cause analysis or actually do RCM or whatever it might be. They're accountable to make sure that the define phase happens. So they could charter a team of people, they could hire a consultant to come in and do these things, whatever it is, whatever the solution is, they're accountable for defining the solution, or the response is the term I use in the book. Okay. You'll notice that assess and define are encompassed within a medium green circle. And the reason I do it that way is that within assess and define, you have not actually authorized any changes yet. You're studying it, you're identifying, right, what are the changes in guidance or direction or assets that we need. So at that point, you then have to make a decision whether we're going to actually authorize the change. Once the change is authorized, then you move over into implement. And implement means that's where we start doing the activities to thoroughly develop the requirements, train people, commission, if we have to put in new equipment or whatever it might be, and then to drive it to common practice. And you'll notice that I leave driving it to common practice as the accountability of the senior person. So remember when we talked about the brain, we can put guidance in place. Guidance loads information into short-term memory. Short-term memory with repetition becomes long-term memory. Our behaviors are based on long-term memory. When we practice a behavior often enough, it becomes a habit. Once it becomes a habit, then we can change the culture, right? And so the senior person needs to stay accountable to make sure that whatever the changes that are being implemented are put into practice and they're driven to common practice, right? Too often, a senior person will put something into practice, they kind of dust off their hands and say they're done, and they move on to the next project before things are driven to a habit or common practice. And so this is kind of a way to make sure that the senior person, right? So again, you can diagnose this. So if you put a new procedure or a process in place and it hasn't been driven to common practice, it's not the lower level people, it's the senior person that hasn't allowed it to go to common practice yet, right?
Yeah, that implementation period measures the success of the program you put in place, and I think a lot of people really miss that point.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where you get program of the month. That's where you get a large change management project that 5 years later you're repeating, right? Because you haven't established the behaviors, and then you haven't got the individual leadership capability to maintain those habits, right?
So I did a paper in my one of my graduate school classes in systems engineering, and it was on TQM in the Coast
Mm-hmm.
Guard. And what I found fascinating, so this retired Master Chief PhD type was my professor, and he said, "Why are you choosing this?" I said, "Well, one, I flipped to the back of the INCOSE handbook and just went, and then looked down and it said quality management under my finger. So I picked quality management that way. But then I thought, well, why is it so important to the Coast Guard's case?" And it was because of exactly this. There was so much senior uh, support behind getting the total quality management program established and pushed out, but there was absolutely no follow through or accountability.
Right.
And so you had an admiral signing a document saying thou shall, and no one shalled.
Yeah. Well, and even better, they had a measurement that you had to report. I think it was two per quarter, two TQM events per quarter. And what did you do? Right. So what did people do? They mailed it in. They said, okay, well, we'll pick something real simple. We can put 3 people on it and they'll knock it off in about 3 hours, and we'll dust it off and say we did that one.
Done.
Right. Because everybody had to report too. So, was the program, there's nothing wrong with TQM. It's a good
Nope.
process. but it's in the execution. It's the messaging and how you put it into place, making sure that people understand the value of doing it, right? All those things, and it just didn't filter down through the organization. So that's kind of what I see there. Um, so again, when I talk about the assess and the define pieces, those identify and authorize requirements. Implement is where the authorized requirements are put into practice. Okay.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. No one knows how to make a point and hit a nail on the head like Dave Forrest.
Right. How you doing, Dave? Good to see you. Yeah. So when I talk about those three elements across the top, assess, define, and implement, if we break them down, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we only have an hour. But if you think again about, remember, the strengths and weaknesses come up from your internal processes and procedures, opportunities and threats come from outside of your organization. So those are the SWOTs. You identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you're kind of collecting them into a backlog. Think of it that way. Then you go into filter and sort. Filter and sort is, we're going to look at what are the most important things to work on. That's filtering, making sure that we're looking at the true SWOT. What is the real problem that we want to be addressing? Sorting is basically putting it into the buckets. So if I'm a manager and I have 4 supervisors that report to me, I'm probably looking at which of those 4 individuals, I'm putting the SWOTs into buckets for those folks. Who's going to deal with it? Who am I going to assign it to? Prioritize is just what it sounds like, right? What's the most important things to the organization or to our group? We want to prioritize those so that because we have limited resources, right? So we can't tell everybody to fix everything. So we have to be able to prioritize. And then we select the ones that we're going to start working on, and we push those over to the define phase. The lower flow chart here, the define phase, then the first thing we do is collect information. What are the things that are important around this SWOT, this thing that we're trying to fix? Then we analyze it. And so that analysis, collecting information, that could be having a FRACIS, right? Failure Recording Corrective Action System in place. Could be using a historian on automated systems and those sorts of things. Could be looking at labor, right? Overtime and all the different things, all the economics that go around this. Analyze then is applying the right tool, and that tool might be RCM, FMEAs, root cause analysis, etc. Then we develop what we think the solution is, right? What's the response that we're going to have for this SWOT? We then need to authorize it, right? So at that point, if it's something like the juice is not worth the squeeze, we're not going to go through this. You just wrap up the project, put it back on the shelf. You might need to dust it off later. It might turn out that it becomes something that you got to go back to, and you don't want to throw away all the data collection and analysis and development of the response. So you just archive that. If it is authorized, then you move it forward into the implement phase. And in the implement phase, you're going to communicate to people what the change is. You're going to actually create or modify, or in some cases, cancel policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. You're going to obtain the assets that you need, right? Because there's a balance between, the guidance and the assets. You're then going to train and qualify people. And qualify could also be if we decide we're going to use, say, outside contractors to do vibration analysis. Well, we want to qualify. We want to make sure that they're ISO certified vibration analysts, for instance, right? So we want to see that credential. Then we want to pilot or fully roll out this change. If it's a minor change, then we just fully roll it out. If it's a major change, we might want to pilot it, make sure that we work the bugs out before we roll it out all over the place. And then we want to keep attention on it to drive it to common practice, right? And I'll say again, this is if you look at John Cotter's change management process or the ADKAR model, all of those fit into this as well. I use different words, but it's the same process when you start driving things to common practice, right? And so once you start driving it to common practice, then this now becomes an issue for the subordinate people, the junior people at that leadership level to carry out. So we're down in the control and stability realm. And there are three elements here: guidance, that includes the current objectives, right? Your direction and objectives. It includes policies, processes, procedures, and measures, what the current guidance is. Assets are the things that are currently available to execute the guidance. And execution is the application of knowledge and skills. And that could be leadership skills, or for individual team members, it could be professional or technical skills, right? So if you're an engineering manager and you have a stable of engineers that are on your team, your execution is at that. If you're the supervisor, manager of that group, they need to be able to execute. Or if it's a work center supervisor and you have trades, those could be the technical skills, knowledge and skills that you're applying. And so what you want to do is apply knowledge and skills to convert the inputs into outputs, and using the current guidance and current assets to generate the strength and weakness data. Okay. So to keep in mind that guidance and assets describe the current requirements, right? The current guidance and the current assets, and they constrain the achievable level of performance. So you'll notice again, on the bottom half of the model, guidance and assets are encompassed within a medium green circle. And that's to signify that those are the current guidance and current assets. So they're treated a little bit differently. Okay. Now, another thing about the model, you notice when I was talking about more circles, right? More circles are, you have three circles and they all touch in two places. And so when one gets big, the other ones get small, and vice versa, right? So when you think about, this is just representations of the bottom half of the model. So when there's a good balance between the current assets, current guidance, and execution, that yellow ring that encompasses all of the circles, that's pretty thin, right? However, if, let's say, the execution is poor, and execution, if it's a leader, it could be because their individual leadership capability is not up to par. If it's an individual team member, it could be that their skills or their knowledge is not up to par, right? So there's ways to fix those through training and mentoring and so forth, right? Or it could be that the current assets are not sufficient. The example I used earlier, you're supposed to have 10 people in your work center, you only have 7, right? Or it could be that the guidance is not sufficient. Hey, we just went out and bought SAP, and that's going to save all of our bacon. It's going to, do everything for us, but there's no procedures and processes written, right? So we need guidance. We need to be able to define what it is that we want people to be doing. And so in those three cases, poor execution, insufficient assets, and insufficient guidance, notice the yellow ring is much wider, right? Because if one or more of those circles get small, then there's a bigger opportunity for improvement. So that yellow ring kind of represents what's the opportunity for improvement. So the wider the yellow ring, the greater the opportunity for improvement. And the other thing is, of course, there can be deficiencies in multiple elements, right? In the proactive improvement and or in the control and stability realm. So again, this is a way to diagnose where the problems are so that you can address those problems. And that's again why I set this model up as categories of accountability, because it can go across any department, any level of leadership. And just a word about this is that requirements are a double-edged sword, right? So there's authorized requirements tell the junior persons what they are supposed to do, how, and with what. But the authorized requirements also commit the senior person to support those authorized requirements, right? So a decision sometimes has to be made. How do you support? What's the balance between the requirements, the guidance and the assets? And so what if guidance and assets are not aligned? What if the requirements are not fully implemented? And what if the requirements dissipate over time, right? So again, you had 10 people in your work center, and they started tridding because they're going into retirement. They're all baby boomers, right? They're all leaving one at a time. So you went from 10 to 9, 9 to 8, 8 to 7, right? So what do you do? So we have identified versus current requirements, right? So what happens when the current requirements are not fully supported? Do you pull resources from other requirements? And if you do, can you still execute all the requirements at the expected level of performance? And then what happens when you communicate a deficiency to a senior person? Do they respond? Do they take action? And we'll talk about how you can deal with that. So assets are finite, right? So guidance needs to be linked with the assets so that decisions can be made regarding the allocation of assets and the requirements that can be completed. So this is kind of a model that I developed. I actually used this a lot when I was in the service. I didn't have it kind of written out as a model, but um, this is what came to be. So on this, there are two elements or two ways to think about it, and that's responsiveness and trust and respect. Okay, so there can be low responsiveness or high responsiveness, and there can be low trust and respect or high trust and respect, and that tells you what quadrant you're in. So the first thing is that when senior persons are unresponsive to resolving an issue, as we said, that junior person needs to bring that issue up to the senior person, and the senior person is accountable to resolve it. What if you bring it up and they're unresponsive, right? They are transferring accountability to their subordinates when they're unresponsive. But keep in mind, the senior person is compensated at a higher level specifically because they're supposed to have that accountability. And so accountability for direction and requirements has to remain with that senior person. So when the senior person doesn't have trust and respect in you, they don't value your opinion. And so when you're identifying problems, don't just tell the senior person that there's a problem. Think about the situation, develop a range of potential solutions, and give a recommended solution and reasoning, right? And so when we do this, so if you're in the upper right quadrant, the sweet spot, that's when the person that you report to has high responsiveness and they have a high amount of trust and respect in what you do, right? That's where you want to be. That's the right spot. The lower right is where that person that you report to is still highly responsive, but the trust and respect may not be at the level that it should be, right? And that could be maybe you're new in the position or that person's new in their position. So you haven't had time to develop the rapport and the trust and respect. So in those cases, your objective is to build trust and respect. You want to identify the problem, develop and recommend the solutions, right? And over time, hopefully that trust and respect will go up. On the left half of the model, that's in both cases, there's low responsiveness. And when that person is the person that you report to is not responsive, you have to force them into being responsive. Okay. And the way that I do that, or I used to do that, was to use the term unless otherwise directed. Right. And so basically, you notify them that there's a problem, you give them a chance to respond. If they don't respond, then you recommend the solution and document that you're recommending that solution to them, right? Do it in an email, do it in a letter, something where it's documented and you can show, yes, I've sent this to this person. And once you send that requirement or your recommendation on how to solve the problem, then you use the term unless otherwise directed, this is what I'm going to do, right? And so what it does is it forces that senior person to respond. So if they respond, you just put the accountability back on that person. If they don't respond, basically they're still responding because you told them unless otherwise directed, this is what I'm going to do. Okay. So either way, you've just pushed the responsibility or the accountability back to the senior person. And so now you go forward, right?
Yeah. And Wayne Barfield made two comments. I didn't want to overlay the slide here,
Hmm.
but Wayne's first point was that there's challenges with having a young but large organization,
Hmm.
using legacy requirements, right? Because they've grown from
Yeah,
what they used to be, and so people are referencing those old requirements and they're outdated, and so there's that lag there, right? And then
right.
on top of that, the leaders, they have to be respectful and open to solutions that the workforce suggests. So there's like a balance there, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
that's again, so to the second point, it could be that, some crotchety old dude was put into that place and that's where he is, right? Um,
Mm,
you still, if you're that person's senior leader, it's on you then to try to mentor that person and make them more open and respectful and so forth. Um, and then to the original point, the first point, same thing. If you've got old mom and pop legacy requirements, well, think about the model, right? So those are SWOTs, right? There's a deficiency. So the deficiency means you assess, you define, you implement updates to those direction, guidance, and assets, right? That's how the model works,
right.
right?
Wayne, I think Tom might have been calling you an old crotchety leader for a moment there, but I won't speak for him.
No, 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 not at all. Not at all.
uh,
Okay, so let's talk about how this how this actually goes through the process, right? So you have, and this is to Wayne's first point, right? So if you have an issue with direction or requirements, the first question to ask is the solution within your authority,
right.
right? So if it's all within your team, presumably you've been delegated the authority to deal with it. So if yes, then you assess, you define and authorize, you implement, you solve the problem. That's all, all these green boxes are right in line with the proactive improvement realm of the model. But what happens if it's not within your authority? You have all these other things, right? So the first thing is you have to communicate the strengths, weakness, opportunities, or threats to your accountable leader, the person that's accountable. Then you ask the question, are they responsive? If it's yes, well, there you go, another green box. The accountable leader acts on it. They assess, define, authorize, implement, and the problem is solved. If they are not responsive, then is it a direction issue? If it's yes, then my recommendation would be that you go ahead and you draft an amended language for direction, the mission, vision, values, or objectives. And then you document that recommendation, submit it to the senior person, and then ask the question again, are they responsive or not? If they are responsive, then it goes back to the accountable leader acting, assess, define, authorize, implement solution. If they're not responsive, that's where you use the unless otherwise directed, right? You've documented that you're pushing that accountability back on that person, then you implement it, solved. Okay. Back up to the upper right corner, then, if it's not a direction issue, it's a requirements issue. It's kind of the same thing. You assess, define, and amend the requirements. You document the recommendation and submit it to the senior person. If they're responsive, they act. They probably just take what you gave them and bless it, and off you go. If they're not responsive, you go back to the unless otherwise directed. And so when you look at the blue boxes, these are kind of part of the control and stability realm. This is where the junior person is accountable for executing and notifying and addressing a deficiency. Okay. So think about it that way. And I put it in blue because next time you're going to see the productive leadership model, most of that's in blue, while the organizational reliability model is generally in green.
Look at you.
Yeah. How about that, huh?
It's almost like you did it on purpose.
Almost.
Now, I got to ask you a
So
question. How long did you get into the model before you went, wait a minute, I can color code these things?
yeah. Um,
Have an aha moment.
oh yeah, and then different blocks get different colors. Yeah, and
That's
you keep
right.
messing around with it as you think it through, right?
That's right.
So the idea here is we want to address issues with the broadest impact first, and then we want to go from highest to lowest levels. So if there's a problem with direction, we want to solve those direction problems first. So mission, vision, values, and objectives. Then we move on to requirements, right? And we set up and we look at the measures, and we look at policies, then plans, then processes, then procedures. Um, Now, I'll say that we also then want to periodically repeat those reviews and make sure we're continually improving. So the first thing is to be clear on direction and requirements. As the junior person, we want to request clarification if it's needed to mission, vision, values, and objectives. And we want to request clarification on things, what I call ambiguities, gaps, and overlaps that affect your team and peer teams, right? So that's the next thing that you look at. And then we want to resolve imbalances between guidance and assets. So if you're the junior person, right, those are the things that you want to work on. When you're trying to execute, those are the things you want to work on. Now, as you're the senior person looking at your team, you want to give clear direction and guidance to your team. And so direction and guidance have to be aligned with senior levels in the organization. And you want to address ambiguities, gaps, and overlaps that are reported by your team. You're now the accountable person to deal with it, right? And then we want to also resolve those imbalances between guidance and assets. Now, one caveat when you look at these, looking at policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures, there can be a lot of process and procedure things that you don't want to delay, right? So even if you have other things that are going wrong, there can be exceptions for environmental health and safety and for things that I call no-brainers, right? Things that are quick wins, right? So you might have a good plan for going through and structuring and organizing how you're going to start from the top and work your way to the bottom. But if there's quick wins, those quick wins are great for building morale and making sure that your folks know that you're listening to them. And obviously the environmental health and safety stuff, if somebody's standing in a regulatory issue, you want to make sure that those get dealt with expeditiously, right?
Right.
And so some of the takeaways, we're almost done. Some of the takeaways here is the model helps you visualize the important accountability interrelationships. So categories of accountabilities apply across all levels of leadership. The senior persons are accountable to provide direction, guidance, and assets. And at each level, the junior person is accountable to execute and to communicate deficiencies. Direction, guidance, and assets. Remember, direction is mission, vision, values, and objectives. Guidance includes policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. Assets are the things we need to carry out guidance. Could be people, budget, software, tools, equipment, whatever. Proactive improvement realm is for creating and modifying direction and requirements. So we want to assess strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, define, authorize, and implement new or modified direction and requirements. The control and stability realm is for the day-to-day activities, right? It's converting inputs into outputs efficiently and effectively. And it's for executing current guidance with current assets. And we also want to be notifying and resolving deficiencies with guidance, direction, guidance, and assets. Okay. And so that's what I had for you today. It's kind of in a nutshell what Chapter 3 is. And my contact information is, up on the top there. And
excellent.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to try and make that a little bit bigger by taking you and I off the slide so they can really get.
Those of you that recognize Ramesh Gulati, he's been an icon in the maintenance and reliability industry. All these folks have been. Doc Palmer wrote the great book, The Planning and Scheduling Handbook. Howard Penrose is just a unbelievably talented guy in the world of electric motors and diagnosis of large electric motors.
Yeah, if you run into Howard out there, tell him he has no experience with wind turbines.
Say, hey, and then grab onto something.
Yeah, and then run. Say, what do you know, Howard? You've never even seen a wind turbine. He and I had some great conversations at SMRP. Just like I could just sit there all day and listen. I'm like expunging. He's just so full of knowledge about those applications, and I've never even touched one. So it's like,
Oh yeah.
it's just fantastic to talk to him.
Yeah, that's just one small part of what he does.
Yeah.
Any motor system, he is just unbelievable.
And I had to step on you right before you mentioned Bob Latino, just because I can't let anyone smoothly transition into talking about Bob. So I apologize.
Yeah, yeah. So Bob, root cause analysis guru, Jack Nicklaus Jr., not the golfer. Jack was a Navy submariner, and he was very instrumental in reliability centered maintenance. Even helped to develop some motor diagnostics. And Klaus Block, he's the head of the University of Tennessee Reliability Maintainability Center. Really, so they've all reviewed my books, and many others have too.
Well, I will. I don't rank on the list of cool guys on this thing for several reasons. One of which is I've never actually written anything to support Tom's book, so I apologize for that, Tom. But this I've met everyone on here in some capacity, and I know some more than others. Except I don't think I've actually ever met Jack Nicklaus. Although the irony there is I work with submarines, so. But this to me is such a well aligned leadership system for what we do. It speaks the language of people in our field. And I think that is absolutely like, because you know how it is. I mean, there's people, oh, well, leadership's been talked about forever. What could I possibly hear that's new or different? This is not a recycled product. This is not the same thing you're going to pick up in any other resource. This is a very well constructed, logical, applicable system for leadership that I think resonates very clearly. And although it has many layers because people are complex, I think it's a no-brainer that if you're looking to create a formal leadership system in any type of technical industry, that this would be one of the, I will never consider it an easy button, right? But this is one of those types of programs you could very successfully implement with the right amount of energy and approach. And it would be nothing but an enjoyable experience for whoever was in charge of implementing it, because it's easy to see the bite-sized fruit that come through this system.
Yeah. And I would say it this way too, Lucas, is if you were a maintenance manager and, so it's modular, right? You don't have to apply it for an entire corporation. Mm-hmm. If you can't get your plant manager to go along with it, then for your department, you can put it into place, right? So you just become the senior person in the organization, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then you can use other tools to try to influence your peers and try to influence up, right? And try to get nothing sells a program better than success, right?
Yeah.
And what in the book, I actually have this model. I call it the football model, and it's another 2x2 matrix. And if you think about, say, the lower left corner is your current level of performance, and the upper right corner is kind of like the performance level you want to get to. And across the bottom is your assets, your performance, and up the side is assets. The idea is you can get from this point to this point two different ways, right? You can go and ask for more assets, ask for more things to try to get to that level. That's what lazy leaders do. Productive leaders go the other route. They increase performance to the point where they can't increase performance anymore. And what they've done is developed credibility so that now when they ask for assets, they can get them. And so it curves this way. And your credibility and your ability to argue for those are based on your performance, based on the fact that you've squeezed as much efficiency and effectiveness out of the things that you were given, right? Before you come to the table and ask for more. And that's, when you hit that, and you see that and you actually do that, your credibility shoots. You all of a sudden become much more sought after to go into positions of higher authority, uh, within or without your company, right? So that to me is another aspect of this, is that it's a modular thing, right? It doesn't have to be it's ideal if you can get it through the entire organization, but it doesn't have to. If you're a line supervisor, you can apply this same thing, right? You provide the direction, guidance, and assets for your team members. You listen to their feedback, you assess, define, and implement changes with your authority because you're responsive and you have trust and respect for your folks, right? It's
Right.
and again, it's modular, and it's that you can diagnose problems in the organization when you think about it using this model.
Yeah, and what really resonated with me before I even opened the book or talked to you about it was talking to Hank Kosovar about it. Hank had told me that you guys were teaming up to go deliver presentations, and I thought, wow, Hank, and if you're listening, this isn't a hit on you. It's a pat on the back. I appreciate this about you. Hank can be critical of things, and
No,
he's good for
no,
it. Right? So like Hank's like got the BS flag hanging out of his back pocket, ready to throw it like a coach challenge.
no. His arm
Um,
is cocked. It's already in his hand.
yeah,
You
I
kidding
love
me?
it. That's what's great about Hank is like, he's someone you can trust to do that. So when I saw that
Yeah.
he was all in on this, I thought, wow, this must be pretty convincing even before I looked into it. So, you passed the Hank Kosovar test. Tom, that might be the greatest accomplishment of your professional career.
It could be.
and Wayne's giving us the laughing because I don't. Hank's never on here to defend himself. When he is, it just shows up as LinkedIn user with no explanation.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah. Yeah.
we'll give him a ribbing for not tuning in if he's not. So. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Tom,
So
tell me a little bit about what you're like. So you obviously have the book, you have a course on this. Do you do consulting and do you do live teaching on this?
yeah, I do consulting, and I do in person. I'll go to plants and develop. I do a 2 day workshop, and I also have a half a day that goes along for it. So when you think about organizational reliability and productive leadership models, I go through all. Well, I start out with all the chapters, but I spend a lot of time on the organizational reliability model and on productive leadership, which will be the next session. Um, but I do a 2 day for all of that. So you think about the people that you put through that training, the senior persons that they report to. I also offer a half a day for them to kind of sensitize them to what these folks are going to learn when they go through. And my hope is that when those senior persons kind of get the aspect of it, with them, I really burn it in that if you don't use it, you lose it. So I try really hard to talk to those senior folks about how do you hold these guys accountable to actually apply what they've learned in the course, right? And I talk to them about, putting things on their annual reviews or their periodic reviews. Put things on your calendar to periodically go through and give them tasking. Ask them how they did with time management. Making sure that they're allocating the proper amount of time, the proper percentage of time to mentoring and coaching versus doing technical work, those sorts of things. So I want them to understand what the folks are learning so that they can apply pressure to make sure that they use it.
Excellent.
Um, and I am starting to work on trying to do a live virtual training. Uh,
Mhm.
so more of that to come. But I also go in and I can do kind of a quick diagnosis of what the leadership and organizational reliability um, current status is. Now that's kind of relative, right? Because it's real
Sure.
hard if you're only going in for a couple of days and looking at things. But it can be useful as kind of a benchmark and
Hmm.
then start working at closing the gaps.
Excellent. See that all means it means so much because it's I think you can look at the productive leadership system as a system of services for various organizations, client types, everything. So if you're the kind of person that is a read a book and implement kind of person, the book is set up for that. If you're the kind of person that prefers to have that hands-on mentorship and coaching, well, obviously, that's an option as well. And Tom's the right personality to work with anyone in the organization from the deck plate level, down on the shop floor, all the way up to the C-suite executive. And he's got great hair. I mean, look at that hair. I'm like 43 years old and I'm still like I'm in boot camp minus a little bit of coverage. So,
Well, it's just like I told you, I came back from hitting a bucket of balls, so I had to go comb my hair because it's kind of windy down here. It's
uh,
about 80 degrees and windy. So,
all the problems of Florida raining down on you.
hey, if people don't put me to work, I got to use my time, right?
Yeah, that's what the message really should be is like help Tom become more like the rest of us miserable people out here by giving him something to do besides play golf.
Yeah. Well, there was walking on the beach this morning too. I rode my bike to the beach and walked up and down.
Yeah, again, rough, just brutal. And
Yeah,
yeah, Wayne weighed in and noted that he thinks having the visit and the ability to follow up virtually is a great resource. I agree. I mean, and for those that don't know Wayne's in Canada, so this is a good example of even across country, in the COVID environment, we have options. We have the ability to help people get these systems in place. Wayne, you know we've known people like Wayne for years. We'd much rather go sit in Canada with Wayne and do this kind of work, have a beer later, share some food. But the reality is, right now, it can be really difficult. But don't let that stop you from doing what's right for your people, right? And
right.
Wayne, this is a pat on the back for you as a good leader out there. You're the kind of person that would do whatever it took, whatever the method was, to make sure that that was right for your people. So,
Yeah.
I hope that serves as a good example for others.
Well, Wayne and I were shipmates in 1987, 88.
No, you weren't. You were like 12. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I knew that you were like in service back then, but I didn't think Wayne was. I thought
Yeah.
Wayne was. It's like, so what were your ranks, if you don't mind me asking? Where were you guys at in your lives at that point?
I was the Ox Shop leading petty officer, and Wayne had just come in from boot camp, actually.
Yes. So we had boot camp Wayne, FNG Wayne,
Yeah, fireman.
fireman Wayne. That is excellent. We saw some pictures of that. I think Wayne shared some pictures of his career. I think it was on Facebook. And I was getting a big trip out of that because even though I wasn't there, I felt like I was. It's like I can relate to that picture.
Yeah.
So
We
that
had a great shop, great bunch of guys in that shop.
Well, I can just imagine the things you guys got into. And the bad part is I only knew you as adults. Like this was way earlier when you weren't quite there yet. So I can just imagine that it was just as professional as it is today. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, Tom, is there anything? Hey, real quick, because some people don't do this, and I think this is a brilliant thing that you've done. The QR code on your slide. Tell people a little bit about what they can do with that QR code.
That would just get you to the site where my books are for sale.
Okay. Well, there you
So,
go. So you don't even have
yeah,
to type in. You don't even have to hop on Google or Amazon and search around. You can just QR code, snap that with your camera on your phone, and off you go. For those that aren't out in the world doing things socially right now, that's how you buy beer in a lot of the bars these days as well. And food in restaurants. They've gotten away from physical menus. So,
not in Florida.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, hey, Wayne, thank you so much for tuning in. And no, we didn't pay Wayne to be active in this session, although I do appreciate his activity. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Thanks, Wayne. We'll talk to you
good
soon.
stuff. Yeah, and for those that have stuck around with us, we really appreciate you tuning in. Tom, I can't thank you enough. There's so much to unpack in your productive leadership system. You're a giver. You're just sharing openly, and I appreciate that. People, if you're not taking advantage of that, you should be. Go get the book. Support Tom. Call him up. Get him the hell off the golf course and give him something to do besides harass the birds on the beach in Florida all day, and he can yell at me later when he's busy, than he already is. It's not to imply that you're not busy, but busier.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just appreciate you coming on, and I'm looking forward to next month's session. And so next month's session, what's the topic of the next chapter?
It's productive leadership. So there's a model that's established for productive leadership. And
Oh,
I think
well,
that's probably where people get the absolute most out of it.
wow,
So I encourage everybody to tune into that one. There'll be a lot.
good.
You could be jamming a lot in there.
That's all right. We can go as long as you want.
Yeah.
Like,
But thank you
normally
very much
when
for having me.
Yeah. That's hey, it's my honor to have you on board, and it's my pleasure to be able to spend time with you, and most importantly, I find it a gift to be able to learn from you. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with everybody, Tom. One day when you and I are sitting on that beach in Florida together drinking a beer, we'll look back at our YouTube channel and say, "Wow, you've got 7 million views on this, and isn't that great?" So. In the interim, we'll have to settle for lower numbers and to en route to the beers, but we'll make it work, man. So,
All good, man. All
all right.
good.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you. And
again, Tom.
Merry Christmas. Happy holidays to everybody. And we'll see you next month, I hope.
Absolutely. We will see you next month. And again, this is as always, is brought to you by East Partnership. You can check us out at www.eastpartnership.org, not .com. You can follow us on LinkedIn. And of course, you can follow us on YouTube. If you are on YouTube, please like and subscribe so that you can get notifications about Tom's next session and all the other great presenters that we have coming to the show on a monthly basis. So, Tom, thank you so much, sir. We will see you on the backside of the new year, and thanks again for sharing with us.
Yes, sir.
All
Take
right,
care. Bye.
take it easy, everybody. Merry Christmas.